So just to provide a little bit of background, fire has been growing. It's probably one of the most rapidly adopted management practices that we're using in Nebraska that private landowners are adopting quite quickly. Over the last couple decades, 2 decades ago, in the spring on a nice day, skies would be pretty clear, but nowadays, if you look out on a spring day, it's not, at least in our area, uncommon to see smoke in 2-3 different directions. And that goes for a lot of groups, but looking specifically at Pheasants Forever in Nebraska, we really started pushing fire heavier in 2008. And since then, we've had 948 fires on private land that's covered 77,000 acres. So that's really, really good growth. We're showing that we're able to put fire on in a lot of places and doing a lot of really good work with it. And that's not a unique story to Pheasants Forever. There's other groups, other organizations, other agencies doing very similar work. If we were to zero in on where I'm at, the Central Les Hills, in the middle of Nebraska, I should have a map of it here, I don't. We have 2.3 million acres of mixed grass prairie. I talked about that in a presentation earlier this week. It's about the size of Yellowstone up there. And from a fire perspective, we have historically about an 8-year return interval on average in that area. And if you were to drive up there and drive around a little bit, a lot of that area looks like this. We have interspersed cropland up there. We do have areas with heavier eastern red cedar loads. We have cool season grass dominated pastures. We have warm season grass dominated pastures, and kind of everything in the middle. But this is kind of a typical grassland up there and what it would look like. So if you've ever sat back and wondered, like I have, about fire, and wondered, man, prescribed fire, that's, I mean, we get the concept, we get what we're doing, but boy, it's kind of an interesting term, prescribed fire. How did we get there? A lot of that anchors back to this fellow right here, and it kind of surrounds him. So some of you may know who this is. A lot of you may not, but this is Herbert Stoddard. He wrote the first kind of definitive book on the bobwhite quail, and that was back in 1931. He was a co-founder of the Tall Timbers Research Station down in Panhandle, Florida, and also covered some ground in Alabama and nearby Georgia as well. And he did all that without even a high school education, dropped out just after junior high. But as he was writing this large treatise on bobwhite quail, which if you can get a copy, hold on to it tight. It's hard to find anything for less than $300. But if you can get a copy, do your due diligence and look into the history of that, of how that book came together. This guy is also he was a contemporary of Leopold's. He was the one that gave the bobwhite quail the name Firebird. That comes back to him, because what he noticed down there in the Panhandle of Florida, in that area in the southeast, was fire is like the practice that really determines quail habitat down there. So when he put this book together, the bobwhite quail, he brings that up over and over and over again. And this is coming into a time when the attitudes about fire were starting to change, and especially from the federal government. And he noticed that the Forest Service, when they were reviewing the bobwhite quail book, they struggled with the idea of fire and putting fire in the ground, especially in a private land system where they're just doing it. And so Stoddard writes, in a gesture that might be termed face-saving, they substitute the expression prescribed burning for controlled burning and insisted that experts must prescribe the practice. So that's where the term prescribed fire comes from. If you ever wondered, there's been a couple ideas that have gone even around the state of Nebraska about what prescribed burning means compared to controlled burning that kind of obfuscate the actual idea and the history behind it, but that's where it comes from. And this is the first time you actually hear the word prescribed burning. And it means something. This isn't just syntax here, but it actually does mean something. If we look at what he's dealing with, Stoddard, in a private land system down in the southeast, and what we're dealing with here in Nebraska in a private land system, there's some very interesting similarities, and there's some differences too. It is private land. If you look at where he's at, fire was something that really never left the system when he was there. People were still using it on a widespread basis. When we're putting fire on the ground, it's almost like reintroducing a species of wildlife. You know, it's been something that's been taken out of our system for a while. Now we're trying to reintroduce it again and restore it again. And so really what I'm trying to get at here is thinking about what we're doing with fire on the ground now and thinking about where we're going and in a private land system. And do we want to keep using prescribed burning, or do we want to continue on to controlled burning? And I'm going to get into that a little bit here about controlled burning, why that could be advantageous, and firstly, what are some of those indicators of controlled burning and ways that we can begin to evolve from prescribed burning into controlled burning. So a few of the indicators for controlled burn evolution, I'll go through a few of them here. When we can begin identifying when are we getting into more of a controlled burn atmosphere. First of all is when we begin to see second entry fires. Right now we're restoring fire, but in a lot of cases we're still putting on a lot of our area the first fire to ever see that grass since Native Americans were there. And it's exciting to see that. But it's just that beginning part, that beginning stage. So once we see that second fire hit that grass and hit that land, now we're starting to see a pretty robust change. I'm having a hard time not noticing that cat. That's okay. But anyways, so second entry fires, we really know that fire as a practice, as a process, is most beneficial once it's in a rotation, once it's becoming a regular part of our systems. One fire by itself isn't really going to be very useful in the long term. Another thing is just getting more involvement by the next generation, by youngsters. Here on the left that's my son Carter out there on a fire, just doing some mop up with that hose. Over there next to him, her name is Avery. She's in my daughter's class. This is a few years ago when she was in kindergarten, but getting them out there and giving them meaningful roles on the fire line, not just for photo ops, but so they're doing something and they understand what they're doing. There, Avery's with her mom, and she's documenting weather, and she's working on her handwriting skills. She's working on things that a kindergartner should do. She took off the day from school that day, but she has a meaningful role in the fire line there. Writing their own burn plans. When landowners begin doing that on their own, instead of relying on, again, those experts and professionals, is a huge step in getting towards more controlled burning instead of prescribed burning. And this is an example of one. I have a guy every year who wants to do his own burn plan, and it's a one-page plan, and it comes to me on lined paper. And you know, he is not getting any points for presentation here, but if you were to read through it, it's well thought out and it has all the parts of a burn plan that he's supposed to have, and he enjoys doing it. Developing permanent fire breaks. So once we get to this stage, we're also starting to think about those second entry fires. When I say permanent here, I just mean a fire break that's going to be used repeatedly. So this doesn't have to be a paved road, but in this case right here, this is a break that a guy has used 3 different times. It's a pasture road, so he has a set unit there, a fire unit that he's going to use time after time again, and he has the future in mind for that. When landowners begin to acquire and assemble their own equipment, either through purchasing or through just building. So here's an example of a truck that we have out in our area. And 2 years ago, this landowner came into my office, proud as a peacock of this engine that he built. And he brought in an itemized list, almost like a receipt of how much every piece cost and how he got every piece. And some he traded for just with hard labor. Some he pulled out of a scrap pile. Some he got at an auction. But with that vehicle right there, and bear in mind, I mean, I wouldn't drive that to Ohio, but that vehicle right there, he paid $1,300 for that whole thing, you know? And I think part of that goes into saying, boy, just our Great Plains ingenuity, people are gonna get this problem figured out. They're not just gonna rest on their laurels, but they're gonna get there, they're gonna do it. The other thing that I like that this suggests is now this individual has in his machine shed, he has a committed piece of equipment to fire. And to me, that suggests sustainability, that they're going to keep doing it. There's a couple other examples. So up here, we have someone who developed their own kind of propane torch for black lining. Down here, someone picked up a harrow just to kind of do some mop up behind there. They built this on their own. Over here, you have a standard flapper that you can buy out of forestry suppliers. And then you have this enormous one that one of our landowners picked up that, I don't know, you could put out a lot of fire with that thing. This one gets to be a little bit more touchy. But when our private landowners are beginning to rely less on conservation funding for the purpose for fire. So if we were to look at a case study of my area, the Luss Hills, right? Again, it's 2.3 million acres. And if we look at that from an 8-year historical fire interval, then let's suppose that's our goal, that we want to get to a point where there's fire on all 2.3 million acres of that sustainably. So every 8 years, that's 87,000 acres a year. If I use NRCS rates for that, for conservation funding at $13.30 an acre, if that's my goal, I'm looking at over almost $4 million a year. Very quickly, that becomes extremely overwhelming, right? So let's say we sober up a little bit. We say, all right, maybe we won't get there. Let's just say we get 25% of those 2 million acres, right? That's 71,000 acres. If we still use those NRCS rates, what does that look like at only 25% of those acres? That's still almost $1 million, right? So at this point, maybe we need to start rethinking how does fire get funded? If we love that fire is growing, we want to keep it growing. Is this model sustainable for us in the future? One of the things I do after fire season every year is I send out surveys for asking landowners their perspective on their fire from the previous year. And so this has the benefit of the hindsight of what was your experience, not just with your fire, but the season, the grazing season following your fire, right? And I look at several different indexes there. And these three that I'm going to show here go from -1 to +1, right? So these are based on a Likert scale that I coded to -1 to +1. So one of the things I asked these landowners is, in the year following your, the grazing season following your fire, did you change your herd size? And really what I found out is no, they don't. It follows right on zero. They didn't take cows off. They didn't add any. They kind of left it the same. Another thing I want to know is, did you change your turnout date for your herd? You know, did you put your cows in a little later? Did you put them in a little bit earlier? There's kind of a prevailing agency idea that we should let your grass rest a little bit after your fire. Don't put them on right away. A lot of people are putting them on maybe a hair later, but I think it's like -0.03. So there's really not a change there either. But then I asked these same landowners, did you notice in this grazing season any change in your livestock gains in pounds per day? So this is where your economics really hit. And what we're finding is they really do. So from a -1 to a +1, they're showing a gain of about 0.4 is what we're showing. So what I'm noticing here, and this isn't from a textbook, and this isn't from just me, some pencil-headed biologist. This is actually from landowners and their peers. What they're observing is no change in herd size, no change in how long they're out there, but they are showing more gains, more economics. So what that's showing me is the economic model is in there, in the system. We maybe need to talk about it a little bit more. We need to celebrate it a little bit more. Maybe we need to do a little bit more research into that. But it's there. That model is there.
3 minutes.
Thank you. And so what I see is we're rekindling this fire economy. Aldo Leopold talks about when the brown buffalo left and the black and white buffalo came in, and he's referring to more of a dairy landscape there. But when we look at the reasons for traditional indigenous fire, we can begin to put these pieces and resemble the fire that we're putting on the ground now, where our Native Americans had a very economical reason for putting fire on the ground. It meant protein to them. And now we can begin to say, boy, we have a real economic reason to put fire on the ground for us, not just with forage for our cattle, but also for getting rid of our trees and providing more forage later. There's one last one that I've noticed that cuts a little bit. So bear with me here. But I really feel like fires become more sustainable when logos begin to vanish from our fires. Once these people on the landscape, these private landowners who own that land, when they become the heroes of their own conservation story, I really believe, and our logos vanish, I really believe that that's something that's going to be able to stay there more permanently and more sustainably. So switching from prescribed fire to controlled burning, how do we do it? It's not, I acknowledge it's not just a shirt that you can take off and another one that you can put back on. It takes a lot of forethought, and that story is going to look different from one place to the next to the next. I provided some indicators of that. In other areas, those indicators might look a little bit different. Some might have some of those shared. This is one of my favorite photos of there on the left. That's Jim Lott. He recently retired from the NRCS. Did a lot of burning in our area, and there's a landowner next to him that Jim Lott is helping work through. And teaching some very key ideas about ignition techniques on this fire. And so it's about handing that torch over. It's about figuring out how far do we go, and when do we let the landowners take over? When do we let them become their own heroes? In a cultural standpoint, we call this knowing when to leave the party. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.